Marcus Thompson had served 3 tours in Afghanistan with the British Special Air Service. After retiring from military life, he moved to Sunny Meadows, a quiet suburban neighborhood in Arizona, hoping to find peace. The 42-year-old veteran bought a modest 2-story house at the end of Maple Street, complete with a small front yard where he planned to grow vegetables and maybe work on his old motorcycle. The neighborhood seemed perfect at first. Children played in the streets, neighbors waved from their porches, and everything felt calm. Marcus had saved enough money from his military pension to buy the house outright, and he looked forward to a simple life away from the chaos of combat zones. What Marcus didn't know was that Sunny Meadows had a homeowners association, and that association was ruled with an iron fist by Margaret Maggie Henderson. At 58 years old, Maggie had been the HOA president for 8 years running. She had short blonde hair that never moved, even in strong winds, and she wore the same style of business suit every day as if she was running a Fortune 500 company instead of policing lawn. Heights and mailbox colors, Maggie lived in the biggest house in the neighborhood, right in the center of the community, where she could see everything that happened on every street. Her living room window faced the main road, and she spent hours each day watching for violations. She had a thick binder filled with HOA rules, regulations, and complaint forms. Some neighbors joked that she knew the rule book better than lawyers knew the law. Marcus first met Maggie on a Tuesday morning in March. He was outside planting tomatoes in his front yard when a black SUV pulled into his driveway. Out stepped a woman in a navy blue suit carrying a clipboard and wearing sunglasses despite the cloudy weather. "Excuse me," Maggie said, her voice sharp and commanding. "Are you the new resident at 247 Maple Street?" Marcus stood up, wiping dirt from his hands on his jeans. "Yes, that's me. Marcus Thompson. Just moved in last month. I'm Margaret Henderson, president of the Sunny Meadows Homeowners Association. I need to discuss some issues with your property." Marcus looked around his yard, confused. He had kept everything neat and clean. The grass was mowed, the driveway was swept, and he hadn't even finished unpacking all his boxes yet. "What kind of issues?" he asked politely. Maggie flipped through papers on her clipboard. "First, your mailbox doesn't match the approved HOA standards. It needs to be forest green with gold lettering. Second, those vegetables you're planting are not on the list of approved landscaping. The HOA requires decorative flowers or shrubs only." Marcus felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his voice calm. Years of military training had taught him to control his emotions, even when dealing with unreasonable people. "I wasn't aware of these rules," he said. "Nobody mentioned them when I bought the house." "Ignorance of the rules is not an excuse," Maggie replied coldly. "You should have received a copy of the HOA guidelines with your purchase documents. I'll give you 2 weeks to fix these violations, or you'll face fines." She handed him a thick packet of papers and turned to leave, but then stopped and looked back at his front door. "Oh, and that needs to be painted too. The current color is not on the approved list." Marcus looked at his front door. It was a perfectly normal brown color that matched the house's trim. "What color should it be?" he asked. "Burgundy, forest green, or navy blue only. Those are the rules." Maggie got back in her SUV and drove away, leaving Marcus standing in his yard holding a stack of HOA regulations. That evening, Marcus sat at his kitchen table reading through the HOA rules. There were 47 pages of regulations covering everything from grass height, no more than 2.5 inches, to the types of plants allowed, a list of exactly 23 approved species. There were rules about car parking, window treatments, outdoor decorations, and even the color of garden hoses. Marcus had spent years following military regulations, but those rules made sense. They kept soldiers safe and missions successful. These HOA rules seemed designed to control every tiny detail of daily life for no good reason. The next morning, Marcus decided to visit some of his neighbors to learn more about the HOA. His first stop was the house next door, where an elderly man named Frank was watering his flowers. "You met the HOA queen yet?" Frank asked with a knowing smile. "Yesterday," Marcus replied. "She wants me to change my mailbox, my door color, and stop growing vegetables." Frank shook his head. "That woman has made life hell for half this neighborhood. Last year, she fined the Johnsons $500 because their Christmas lights were the wrong shade of white. She measured Mrs. Peterson's grass with a ruler and gave her a violation because it was 2.6 inches tall instead of 2.5. "Can't people just ignore her?" Marcus asked. She has the power to put liens on your house if you don't pay the fines, Frank explained. Some folks have spent thousands of dollars fighting her in court. Others just gave up and moved away. As Marcus walked back to his house, he noticed Maggie's black SUV parked across the street. She was sitting inside, watching him through binoculars. When she saw him looking, she quickly drove away. That afternoon, Marcus received his first official HOA violation notice in the mail. It listed 3 infractions with a total fine of $350 if not corrected within 14 days. At the bottom, Maggie had written a personal note. "Welcome to Sunny Meadows. We expect all residents to follow our community standards without exception." Marcus set the letter down on his kitchen table and looked out at his small vegetable garden. He had planned to grow tomatoes, peppers, and herbs, the same foods his grandmother had taught him to cultivate when he was a boy in Manchester. After years of eating military rations in desert camps, he wanted to grow something fresh and healthy with his own hands. But now this woman was telling him that vegetables were against the rules, that his door was the wrong color, and that his mailbox wasn't good enough for her precious neighborhood standards. Marcus had faced down armed insurgents in Afghanistan, had survived roadside bombs and firefights, but he had never encountered anyone quite like Margaret Henderson. She wasn't just enforcing rules. She was using those rules as weapons to control and intimidate her neighbors. As the sun set over Sunny Meadows, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He wasn't going to be bullied by an HOA president with too much power and too much time on her hands. Tomorrow he would start fighting back. The next morning, Marcus decided to do what he did best: gather intelligence. In the military, you never went into a situation blind. You studied your enemy, learned their weaknesses, and found their pressure points. Margaret Henderson was about to discover that she had picked the wrong veteran to mess with. Marcus spent the day walking through Sunny Meadows, talking to neighbors, and taking notes. What he learned made his blood boil. Maggie hadn't just been targeting him, she had been terrorizing the entire community for years. Mrs. Chen showed him a stack of violation notices she had received for planting roses that were supposedly the wrong shade of red. The 73-year-old widow had been fined $200 over 6 months because Maggie claimed her flowers were salmon pink instead of true red, even though they looked identical. To roses in other yards, the Williams family had been forced to repaint their house twice because Maggie kept changing her mind about what counted as approved beige. They had spent $3,000 and still lived in fear of the next violation. Notice. Most shocking was the story of Tom Bradley, a retired police officer who lived 3 streets over. Tom had put up a small American flag in his front yard on Memorial Day. Maggie had cited him for unauthorized decorative displays and threatened daily fines until he removed it. She said flags weren't on the approved decoration list, Tom told Marcus, shaking his head in disgust. "I served this country for 30 years and she's telling me I can't fly its flag in my own yard." By evening, Marcus had a clear picture of the situation. Maggie had created a reign of terror using HOA rules as her weapon. She targeted anyone who didn't bow to her authority, and she seemed to especially enjoy bullying elderly residents and veterans who reminded her that there were things more important than perfect lawns and matching mailboxes. That night, Marcus sat down at his computer and began researching. He discovered that Arizona state law had specific protections for military veterans regarding HOA restrictions. More importantly, he found that many of Maggie's rules might not be legally enforceable. The next day was Saturday, and Marcus was working in his garden when Maggie's SUV pulled up again. This time she brought backup, a thin man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as the HOA's lawyer. "Richard Whitman." "Mr. Thompson," Whitman said in a nasal voice, "you have failed to correct the violations on your property. The HOA is prepared to begin legal proceedings against you." Marcus stood up slowly, his military training evident in his posture. He was 6 feet tall and built like someone who had spent years carrying heavy equipment across difficult terrain. Next to him, the lawyer looked like a scared child. "Before you start any legal proceedings," Marcus said calmly, "you might want to check Arizona Revised Statute 33-1261. It specifically protects veterans from certain HOA restrictions, especially those related to landscaping for food production." Whitman's face went pale. He clearly hadn't expected the new resident to know anything about HOA law. Maggie stepped forward, her voice rising. "I don't care what the law says. These are our neighborhood rules, and everyone follows them or they can move somewhere else. Actually, Marcus continued, I also checked the original HOA covenant that was filed when this neighborhood was built. Interesting thing, vegetable gardens were explicitly allowed in the original agreement. It seems like your current restrictions were added later without proper legal authority. The lawyer whispered something in Maggie's ear, but she pushed him away angrily. You think you can come into our neighborhood and disrupt everything we've built here? She snapped. I don't care if you were in the military. This is my community and I decide what's acceptable. Your community? Marcus asked quietly. I thought this was a neighborhood where people owned their own homes and had certain rights. Maggie's face turned red. She had never had anyone challenge her so directly, especially not with actual legal knowledge. We'll see about that, she said, storming back to her SUV. You have no idea who you're dealing with. After they left, Marcus called his old friend James Crawford, who had served with him in Afghanistan and now worked as a military attorney in California. Jimmy, Marcus said when his friend answered the phone, I need some help with a legal matter. What kind of trouble are you in now, Marcus? James laughed. Marcus explained the situation with the HOA and Maggie Henderson. As he talked, James's tone became more serious. This woman sounds like a piece of work, James said. But here's the thing. You're in a much stronger position than she realizes. Arizona has some of the strongest veteran protection laws in the country. Plus, if she's been selectively enforcing rules and targeting people based on personal grudges, that's discrimination. What do you suggest? Marcus asked. Document everything. Get statements from your neighbors about how she's been treating them. And Marcus, be very careful. People like this HOA president don't like losing control. She might escalate things in ways you don't expect. That weekend, Marcus organized a neighborhood barbecue in his backyard. He invited everyone on his street and asked them to spread the word. By Sunday afternoon, 37 people had shown up, the biggest neighborhood gathering anyone could remember. As people shared their stories about Maggie Henderson, a pattern became clear. She didn't just enforce rules. She invented new ones on the spot when she wanted to target someone. She had different standards for different people, often giving her friends warnings while finding her enemies immediately. Mrs. Peterson, the elderly woman whose grass had been measured with a ruler, broke down in tears as she described how Maggie had harassed her after her husband died. She came to my house 3 days after the funeral, Mrs. Peterson sobbed. My husband wasn't even buried yet, and she was complaining that I hadn't mowed the lawn. I was 75 years old, and I just lost my partner of 50 years, and she was worried about grass height. Tom Bradley, the retired police officer, stood up with fire in his eyes. That woman needs to be stopped. She's not just breaking HOA rules, she's destroying this community. By the end of the barbecue, Marcus had something he hadn't expected when he moved to Sunny Meadows. An army of neighbors ready to fight back against Margaret Henderson's tyranny. But Maggie wasn't done with him yet. On Monday morning, Marcus woke up to find a certified letter taped to his front door. Inside was a notice that the HOA was fining him $100 per day until he removed his vegetable garden, changed his door color, and replaced his mailbox. The fines had started 3 days ago. At the bottom of the letter, Maggie had written another personal note. Some people learn the easy way. Others learn the hard way. Which type are you, Mr. Thompson? Marcus looked at the letter, then at his small garden where tiny tomato plants were just beginning to grow. In Afghanistan, he had learned that bullies only understood one language: strength. It was time to show Margaret Henderson that she had picked a fight with the wrong veteran. He picked up his phone and called James again. Jimmy, he said, I think it's time to go to war. Marcus Thompson had made a career out of strategic planning, and now he was about to put those skills to use against Margaret Henderson. But first, he needed to understand exactly what he was dealing with. Over the next week, he conducted what he called reconnaissance operations throughout Sunny Meadows. What he discovered was worse than he had imagined. Maggie hadn't just been collecting fines, she had been systematically driving certain residents out of the neighborhood while protecting her inner circle of supporters. The Henderson HOA had forced 12 families to sell their homes over the past 3 years, all because they couldn't afford to keep paying escalating fines for violations that seemed to multiply every week. Meanwhile, houses owned by Maggie's friends somehow never received violations, even when they clearly broke the same rules. Marcus learned that Maggie's own house violated at least 6 HOA regulations. Her fence was 3 inches too tall. She had unauthorized flowering plants in her backyard, and her driveway was cracked in multiple places, something that would have resulted in immediate fines for anyone else. The real breakthrough came when Marcus was talking to Sarah Mitchell, a young mother who lived 2 blocks away. Sarah worked as a bookkeeper for a small business downtown, and she had been keeping detailed records of every HOA interaction since moving to Sunny Meadows 3 years ago. "Look at this," Sarah said, spreading papers across her kitchen table. "Maggie has collected over $180,000 in fines from residents in just the past 2 years. But here's the weird part. Almost none of that money shows up in the HOA's official financial records." Marcus studied the documents. Sarah was right, the numbers didn't add up. According to the official HOA budget that was supposed to be shared with all residents, the association had collected only $23,000 in fines during the same period. "Where's the rest of the money going?" Marcus asked. "That's what I'd like to know," Sarah replied. "I think Maggie might be keeping it for herself." This changed everything. If Maggie Henderson was stealing money from the HOA, that wasn't just a civil matter, it was criminal fraud. Marcus knew he needed professional help to prove it. He called his friend James Crawford again, and this time James took the case seriously enough to fly to Arizona for the weekend. When James arrived on Friday evening, he brought something Marcus hadn't expected. Backup. "Marcus, I want you to meet Angela Rodriguez," James said as they stood in Marcus's living room. "She's a forensic accountant who specializes in HOA fraud cases. Angie, this is my old squad leader I told you about." Angela was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who spoke quickly and carried herself with the confidence of someone who had taken down bigger criminals than small-time HOA presidents. "I've seen cases like this before," Angela said as she reviewed Sarah Mitchell's documents. "This Henderson woman has all the classic patterns of someone who's been embezzling from the association. The question is how long she's been doing it and how much she's stolen." Over the weekend, Angela worked with Sarah and several other neighbors to piece together the financial picture. What they found was staggering. Margaret Henderson had been systematically stealing from the Sunny Meadows HOA for at least 5 years. She had created fake expenses, double-billed for maintenance work that was never done, and pocketed thousands of dollars in fines that she never reported to the HOA board. The total theft was estimated at over $320,000. "This is enough to put her in prison for several years," Angela explained to the group that had gathered in Marcus's backyard Sunday evening. "But we need to be very careful about how we handle this. If she suspects we're investigating her, she might destroy evidence or try to cover her tracks." Marcus nodded. "In the military, you didn't reveal your battle plan to the enemy until you were ready to strike. But Maggie Henderson wasn't sitting idle either. On Monday morning, she launched her most aggressive attack yet. Marcus woke up to find 3 different violation notices taped to his front door, along with a new threat. The first violation was for excessive noise. Apparently, his weekend barbecue had been too loud, even though several neighbors had commented on how quiet and respectful everyone had been. The second violation was for unauthorized gathering. The HOA apparently had a rule limiting social events to 10 people or fewer without prior approval. The third violation was the most ridiculous, intimidating landscaping choices. According to Maggie, Marcus's vegetable garden was designed to send a hostile message to the community and create an atmosphere of non-compliance. The total fines for all 3 violations were $2,500, due immediately, but it was the letter attached to the violations that crossed the line. In it, Maggie had written, "Mr. Thompson, your military background does not give you special privileges in this community. Many residents have expressed concerns about having someone with your training living in their peaceful neighborhood. Perhaps you would be more comfortable in a community that better suits your aggressive nature." Marcus read the letter twice, feeling his anger rise. Maggie Henderson had just made this personal by attacking his military service and implying that he was somehow dangerous to his neighbors. She was trying to paint him as an unstable veteran who couldn't fit into civilian life. That afternoon, Marcus drove to the local Army surplus store and made a purchase that would change the entire dynamic of his war with the HOA president. He bought a small digital camera designed for wildlife observation, the kind that hunters use to monitor deer trails. That night, Under cover of darkness, Marcus used his military training to install the camera in a tree that overlooked Maggie's house. If she was going to spy on him and his neighbors, it was time to return the favor. The camera would capture everything that happened in Maggie's front yard, including who visited her house and what kind of vehicles they drove. More importantly, it would document whether she was following the same HOA rules she enforced so strictly on everyone else. Within 48 hours, the camera had captured something Marcus hadn't expected. On Wednesday morning at 7:30 a.m., a white van with Henderson Property Management painted on the side pulled into Maggie's driveway. Two men got out and began doing maintenance work on her house, painting her fence, trimming her bushes, and fixing her cracked driveway. According to the HOA financial records that Angela Rodriguez had obtained, the association had paid Henderson Property Management over $45,000 in the past year for neighborhood maintenance. But the work was being done on Maggie's personal property, not on common areas that belonged to the entire community. Marcus had just discovered that Margaret Henderson wasn't just stealing fine money from the HOA, she was also billing the association for personal home improvements. That evening, Marcus called a meeting with his core group of neighbors. Angela Rodriguez joined them by video call from California. "We've got her," Angela said when Marcus showed her the surveillance footage. "This is direct evidence of fraud. She's using HOA money to pay for work on her personal property. What's our next move?" asked Tom Bradley, the retired police officer. Marcus looked around the room at his neighbors, people who had been terrorized by Maggie Henderson for years, but were now ready to fight back. "We're going to do what we should have done from the beginning," he said. "We're going to call the police and have her arrested for theft and fraud." But James Crawford held up his hand. "Wait," he said. "If we move too fast, she might get away with a plea bargain and light punishment. I have a better idea, one that will make sure she never bothers anyone in this neighborhood again." Marcus leaned forward. "What are you thinking, Jimmy?" James smiled the same way he used to before they went out on night missions in Afghanistan. "We're going to let her dig her own grave a little deeper first, and then we're going to bury her in it." James Crawford's plan was brilliant in its simplicity. Instead of confronting Maggie Henderson immediately, they would give her enough rope to hang herself. Marcus would appear to be backing down while secretly documenting every illegal move she made. "She's gotten away with this for years because nobody ever stood up to her properly," James explained to the group gathered in Marcus's living room. "She's overconfident now. If we make her think she's winning, she'll get careless and make bigger mistakes." The plan required Marcus to do something that went against every instinct he had developed in the military. He had to pretend to surrender. On Thursday morning, Marcus walked across the street to Maggie Henderson's house and knocked on her front door. When she answered, he was holding an envelope. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, making his voice sound defeated. "I want to apologize for the trouble I've caused in the neighborhood. You were right. I should have learned the rules before challenging your authority." Maggie's eyes lit up with victory. She had broken another resident just like she had broken so many others. "Well, Mr. Thompson," she said with a smug smile, "I'm glad you've finally seen reason. What's in the envelope?" "A check for all the fines you've issued," Marcus replied. "And a request to remove my vegetable garden and repaint my front door. I just want to fit in with the community." Maggie took the envelope greedily. Inside was a check for $20,500 and a letter of complete submission that James Crawford had helped Marcus write. "This is exactly what I like to see," Maggie said. "New residents need to understand that we have standards here. I accept your apology, and I'll make sure the other neighbors know that you've decided to be a team player." As Marcus walked back to his house, he felt sick to his stomach. Pretending to bow down to a bully was one of the hardest things he had ever done. But he knew it was necessary to catch her in the act of more serious crimes. Over the next 2 weeks, Maggie Henderson went on a power trip that exceeded anything she had done before. With Marcus apparently defeated, she felt invincible and began targeting other residents with renewed aggression. She fined the Morrison family $800 for having a garden gnome that wasn't on the approved decoration list, even though the same type of gnome sat in her friend Linda Patterson's yard without any violations. She issued a violation to 82-year-old Mr. Kowalski for having grass that was too green, claiming it made other lawns look bad by comparison. When Mr. Kowalski asked how grass could be too green, She threatened to double his fines for questioning HOA authority. Most outrageously, she began charging residents $50 each time she had to inspect their property for violations. This was a completely made-up fee that appeared nowhere in the HOA bylaws, but people paid it because they were afraid of facing even larger fines. Marcus's surveillance camera captured all of this activity, along with more evidence of Maggie's personal corruption. The Henderson property management van returned 3 more times, doing extensive work on Maggie's house that was clearly being paid for with HOA funds. But the breakthrough came on a Tuesday afternoon, when Marcus's camera recorded something unexpected. A black sedan pulled into Maggie's driveway, and out stepped Richard Whitman, the HOA lawyer, carrying a briefcase. Marcus couldn't hear the conversation, but he could see Whitman hand Maggie a thick envelope. She opened it, counted what appeared to be cash, and then handed him a folder from inside her house. After Whitman left, Marcus called Angela Rodriguez in California. "I think the lawyer is in on it," Marcus told her, describing what he had seen. "That makes sense," Angela replied. "I've been looking into the legal fees the HOA has been paying." Whitman's firm has billed the association for over $90,000 in the past 2 years, mostly for property compliance consultations. That's an insane amount of money for an HOA this size. "What do you think they're doing?" Marcus asked. "My guess is that Whitman is helping her launder the money she's stealing. He creates fake legal bills, the HOA pays his firm, and then he kicks back cash to Maggie. It's a classic money laundering scheme. This was even bigger than they had imagined. Maggie Henderson and her lawyer weren't just stealing from the HOA. They were running an organized criminal enterprise." Marcus called James Crawford immediately. "Jimmy, we've got them on racketeering charges now. This isn't just petty theft anymore." "Excellent," James replied. "But we need one more piece of evidence before we can move. We need to prove that she's been systematically targeting people based on discrimination. The veterans' rights violations are good, but if we can show a pattern of discrimination against elderly residents or minorities, we can add federal civil rights charges." That evidence came sooner than expected. On Friday afternoon, Marcus watched through his window as Maggie Henderson stormed across the street to the house owned by Rosa and Miguel Fernandez, a young Hispanic couple who had moved in 6 months ago. Marcus couldn't hear the conversation from his house, but he could see that it was heated. Rosa was shaking her head while Maggie pointed aggressively at their front yard. Miguel came outside and tried to calm the situation, but Maggie began shouting and waving papers in the air. After Maggie left, Marcus walked over to check on his neighbors. "She's completely out of control," Rosa said, tears in her eyes. "She claims our house numbers are the wrong font and our mailbox is 6 inches too far to the left. She wants us to pay $200 in fines and move our mailbox, even though it's exactly where the previous owners had it." Miguel showed Marcus the violation notice. It was clearly targeted harassment. The same type of mailbox and house numbers could be seen on 6 other houses in the neighborhood, without any violations. "But that's not the worst part," Miguel continued. "She told Rosa that maybe people who don't speak perfect English shouldn't live in a community with such high standards. She said we should move somewhere more suitable for our kind of people. That was it. Maggie Henderson had just committed a federal hate crime by discriminating against residents based on their ethnicity and national origin." Marcus had heard enough. That evening, he called an emergency meeting of all the neighbors who had been working with him to document Maggie's crimes. "It's time," he announced when everyone had gathered in his backyard. "We have enough evidence to put both Henderson and her lawyer in prison for a very long time. Tomorrow morning, we're going to the FBI." Tom Bradley, the retired police officer, raised his hand. "I have a contact at the Phoenix FBI field office. Agent Sarah Martinez specializes in public corruption cases. I can set up a meeting for tomorrow." "Perfect," Marcus replied. "But there's one more thing we need to do first. We need to make sure Maggie doesn't destroy any evidence before the FBI can search her house and office." James Crawford had been quiet throughout the meeting, but now he spoke up. "I have an idea about that," he said with a grin. "Marcus, remember when we used to do surveillance operations in Helmand Province? We had ways of keeping targets busy while the intelligence guys went through their compounds." Marcus smiled for the first time in weeks. "What did you have in mind?" "Tomorrow morning you're going to knock on Maggie Henderson's door and tell her that you've changed your mind about surrendering. You're going to announce that you're running for HOA president and that you're going to fight every single violation she's ever issued. That will keep her. Attention focused on me while the FBI searches her property. Marcus realized exactly. She'll be so furious that she won't notice anything else happening around her. Angela Rodriguez joined the video call from California. I've prepared a complete financial analysis of the fraud scheme. The FBI will have everything they need to get search warrants for both Henderson's house and the lawyer's office. As the meeting broke up, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced since leaving the military, the satisfaction that came from a perfectly planned mission that was about to succeed. Margaret Henderson had terrorized the residents of Sunny Meadows for years, stealing their money and destroying their peace of mind. She had discriminated against veterans, elderly residents, and minorities while protecting her friends and enriching herself. Tomorrow, her reign of terror would come to an end. But first, Marcus needed to make one phone call to someone special, someone whose involvement would ensure that Maggie Henderson's defeat would be both complete and legendary. The phone call Marcus made that night would change everything. He dialed a number he hadn't used in 3 years. His former commanding officer, Colonel David Harrison, who now worked at the British Embassy in Washington. D.C. Marcus Thompson. Colonel Harrison's familiar voice came through the phone. I heard you'd retired to the colonies. How are you finding civilian life? It's been interesting, sir, Marcus replied. Actually, I'm calling because I need some advice about a situation involving discrimination against military veterans. Marcus explained the entire situation with Margaret Henderson, the HOA fraud, and the targeted harassment of elderly residents and minorities. As he talked, Colonel Harrison's tone became increasingly serious. Marcus, what you're describing isn't just local corruption, the colonel said. If this woman has been systematically targeting veterans and using HOA rules to discriminate against protected classes, this could be a federal civil rights case. More importantly, if she's been harassing British veterans who are legal U.S. residents, the embassy might have grounds to get involved. I hadn't thought of it that way, sir. Here's what I want you to do. Document everything and send it to me tonight. I'm going to contact the FBI's Civil Rights Division and the Department of Justice. This Henderson woman is about to discover what happens when she targets the wrong people. The next morning arrived with the kind of crystal-clear Arizona sunshine that made everything seem possible. Marcus put on his best shirt and walked across the street to Margaret Henderson's house. It was 8 a.m. sharp, early enough to catch her before she left for her daily rounds of neighborhood harassment. Maggie answered the door in her bathrobe. Looking surprised to see Marcus on her doorstep, Mr. Thompson, she said suspiciously. What are you doing here so early? Marcus took a deep breath and delivered the performance of his lifetime. Mrs. Henderson, I've been thinking about our conversation last week, and I've decided that you're absolutely right about maintaining neighborhood standards. In fact, I'm so impressed with your leadership that I've decided to run for HOA president myself. The color drained from Maggie's face. You what? I think my military background would be perfect for organizing the community and making sure everyone follows the rules properly. I've already talked to several neighbors, and they're excited about having some new leadership. Maggie's shock quickly turned to rage. You can't do that. I've been president for 8 years. This is my neighborhood. Well, according to the HOA bylaws, there's supposed to be an election every 2 years. Marcus continued calmly. When was the last election held? Maggie's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. The truth was, there hadn't been an election in over 6 years. She had simply declared herself president for life and nobody had challenged her. That's not how it works, she stammered. The board appoints the president. What board? Marcus asked innocently. I've looked at the official HOA documents filed with the county, and there's no record of any board meetings or board member elections since 2019. This was true. Angela Rodriguez had discovered that Maggie had been running the HOA as a one-person dictatorship, ignoring all the legal requirements for proper governance. You don't know what you're talking about. Maggie shouted, now fully awake and furious. I'll have you thrown out of this neighborhood. I'll fine you into bankruptcy. Actually, Marcus said, pulling out his phone, I'm recording this conversation. I hope you don't mind, but I want to make sure I have documentation of all HOA interactions going forward. Maggie's eyes went wide with panic. She slammed the door in Marcus's face, but he could hear her inside, frantically making phone calls. Perfect. While Maggie was distracted by his challenge to her authority, FBI agents were already getting search warrants based on the evidence package that Colonel Harrison had delivered to the Department of Justice. At exactly 10:30 a.m., 3 black SUVs pulled into Sunny Meadows. Marcus watched from his living room window as FBI agents in bulletproof vests surrounded both Margaret Henderson's house and the office building, where Richard Whitman's law firm was located. Agent Sarah Martinez, Tom Bradley's contact at the FBI, led the team that knocked on Maggie's front door. When Maggie answered, still in her bathrobe, Agent Martinez showed her the search warrant. Margaret Henderson, you're under investigation for mail fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, and civil rights violations. We have a warrant to search these premises and seize any documents related to the Sunny Meadows Homeowners Association. Maggie's legs gave out, and she had to grab the doorframe to keep from falling. This is impossible, she whispered. You can't do this to me. Ma'am, please step aside and allow our agents to conduct their search, Agent Martinez said firmly. Meanwhile, at Richard Whitman's law office, another team of FBI agents was discovering a treasure trove of evidence. Whitman had kept detailed records of his money laundering scheme, apparently thinking he was too smart to get caught. In his office safe, agents found over $47,000 in cash, along with ledgers showing exactly how much money he had been stealing from the HOA and kickbacks he had been paying to Maggie Henderson. But the real bombshell came when agents searched Maggie's home office. Hidden behind a false wall in her closet, they found boxes containing thousands of dollars in cash, fake invoices for work that was never done, and most damning of all, a handwritten journal where Maggie had documented her discrimination against various residents. The journal entries were shocking in their casual cruelty. Find the old Polish man again today. These foreigners need to learn that America has standards. The Mexican couple keeps trying to argue with me in their broken English. Maybe if I find them enough, they'll move back where they came from. Another military guy moved in on Elm Street. I hate these soldier types who think they're heroes. Need to find violations to teach him his place. Agent Martinez later told Marcus that she had rarely seen such clear evidence of discriminatory intent in a civil rights case. By noon, both Margaret Henderson and Richard Whitman were in FBI custody, charged with multiple federal crimes. The charges included mail fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, and civil rights violations. As news of the arrests spread through Sunny Meadows, neighbors began gathering in the streets. People who had been living in fear of HOA violations for years were suddenly celebrating like prisoners who had been released from jail. Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman who had been fined for planting the wrong color roses, was crying tears of joy. I can't believe it's finally over, she kept saying. The Williams family immediately went to the hardware store and bought paint to repaint their house in their favorite color, a cheerful yellow that had been banned by Maggie's rules, Tom. Bradley hung up the biggest American flag he could find, right in the center of his front yard, but the celebration was interrupted by an unexpected arrival. At 2 p.m., a black limousine with diplomatic plates pulled into the neighborhood, followed by 2 security vehicles. Out of the limousine stepped Colonel David Harrison in full-dress uniform, accompanied by 2 officials from the British Embassy and a representative from the U.S. State Department. Marcus walked out to meet them, still hardly believing what was happening. Marcus, Colonel Harrison said with a formal handshake, the British government takes discrimination against our veterans very seriously, especially when they're legal residents of allied nations. We're here to make sure this case receives the full attention it deserves. The State Department representative, a stern woman named Catherine Mills, addressed the gathered neighbors. Ladies and gentlemen, what happened in your community represents a serious violation of civil rights laws. The Department of Justice will be prosecuting this case to the fullest extent of the law. We want you to know that your government takes these matters seriously. As the diplomatic convoy left, Marcus realized that his simple dispute with an HOA president had escalated into an international incident involving 2 governments and multiple federal agencies. That evening, as Marcus sat in his backyard looking at his small vegetable garden, Tom Bradley came over with 2 beers. So, Tom said with a grin, how does it feel to take down a criminal empire over some tomato plants? Marcus laughed, the first genuine laugh he'd had since moving to Sunny Meadows. Honestly, it feels like the most important mission I've ever completed. The next morning brought news that would make Margaret Henderson's defeat complete and legendary. But that's a story for tomorrow. The morning news brought developments that exceeded everyone's wildest expectations. Marcus was drinking coffee in his kitchen when his phone rang. It was James Crawford calling from California, and he was laughing so hard he could barely speak. "Marcus, turn on Channel 12 News right now. You're not going to believe this." Marcus grabbed his remote and switched on the television. The lead story made him nearly drop his coffee mug. Breaking news this morning. The FBI raid on a Phoenix area HOA has uncovered what federal prosecutors are calling one of the largest HOA fraud schemes in Arizona history. Margaret Henderson, the former president of the Sunny Meadows Homeowners Association, and attorney Richard Whitman have been charged with stealing over $400,000 from residents over a 5-year period. The news anchor continued. In a surprising twist, the investigation was triggered by complaints filed with both the FBI and the British Embassy regarding discrimination against military veterans. The case has now drawn international attention, with British officials calling it an example of how some Americans treat Allied veterans who have served alongside U.S. forces. But that wasn't the end of the story. The reporter went on to explain that the FBI had discovered Maggie's scheme was even larger than anyone had imagined. She hadn't just been stealing from the Sunny Meadows HOA. She had been running similar operations in 3 other neighborhoods across Phoenix. Federal agents estimate that Henderson may have stolen over $1.2 million from various homeowners associations, making this one of the largest HOA fraud cases in U.S. history. Marcus's phone started ringing constantly. News reporters wanted interviews. Neighbors wanted to thank him. And people from other neighborhoods who had been victimized by similar HOA tyrants wanted his advice on how to fight back. The most interesting call came from Angela Rodriguez, the forensic accountant who had helped expose Maggie's crimes. "Marcus, you need to know something," Angela said. "The FBI found evidence that Maggie wasn't working alone. She was part of a network of crooked HOA presidents across the Southwest. They were sharing information about how to maximize fines and steal money without getting caught." "How many people were involved?" Marcus asked. "At least 12 HOA presidents in Arizona, Nevada, and California. The FBI is calling it Operation Clean Sweep. They're arresting HOA criminals all over the region." This was incredible. Marcus's fight against one neighborhood bully had exposed a criminal conspiracy that stretched across multiple states. Later that afternoon, Agent Sarah Martinez visited Marcus to give him an update on the investigation. "Mr. Thompson, I wanted you to know that Margaret Henderson tried to make a deal with prosecutors this morning," Agent Martinez explained as they sat in Marcus's living room. "She offered to testify against the other HOA presidents in exchange for a reduced sentence." "What did the prosecutors say?" Marcus asked. "They laughed at her. She's looking at 15 to 20 years in federal prison. The civil rights violations alone carry a 10-year minimum sentence, and that's before we add in the fraud and money laundering charges." Agent Martinez went on to explain that Richard Whitman was facing similar charges, and both of them would likely spend the rest of their productive lives in prison. "There's something else," Agent Martinez continued. "The IRS is now investigating Henderson for tax evasion. She apparently never reported any of the money she stole as income. That's another 5 to 7 years in prison." The next day brought even more good news. Marcus opened his mailbox to find an official letter from the Maricopa County Attorney's Office. Inside was a check for $2,500, the exact amount he had paid in fake HOA fines to Maggie Henderson. The letter explained that all fines collected by Margaret Henderson over the past 5 years were being refunded to residents, since they had been collected through fraudulent and discriminatory practices. But the biggest surprise came that weekend when Marcus was working in his vegetable garden. A convoy of motorcycles pulled into the neighborhood, 12 riders wearing military patches and American flags. The lead rider removed his helmet and walked over to Marcus. He was a tall man with graying hair and the bearing of someone who had spent years in uniform. "Are you Marcus Thompson?" the man asked. "Yes, I am. I'm Colonel Mike Stevens, U.S. Army, retired. We heard about what you did here, and we wanted to come thank you personally." Colonel Stevens explained that news of Marcus's fight against HOA discrimination had spread through veteran communities across the Southwest. Veterans who had been harassed by their own HOAs were now coming forward with complaints. and several more criminal investigations had been launched. "What you did here wasn't just about your neighborhood," Colonel Stevens said. "You stood up for every veteran who's been bullied by these petty tyrants who think they can push around people who serve their country." The other veterans gathered around, and Marcus learned that they had all had similar experiences with overzealous HOA officials who seemed to particularly target military families. "We've started a network," one of the veterans explained. "Any time an HOA tries to discriminate against veterans, we're going to fight back just like you did. We're calling it the Veterans HOA Defense Network." That evening, the neighborhood held the biggest block party in Sunny Meadows history. Over 200 people attended, including residents from neighboring communities who had heard about the victory over Margaret Henderson. The party featured food trucks, live music, and a special ceremony where Tom Bradley presented Marcus with a flag that had flown over the state capitol in honor of his service to the community. But the most meaningful moment came when Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman who had been fined for her rose garden, stood up to address the crowd. "For 8 years, we lived in fear in our own homes," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "We were afraid to plant flowers, afraid to paint our houses, afraid to fly our flags. Margaret Henderson made us feel like prisoners in our own neighborhood." The crowd murmured agreement. But Marcus Thompson showed us that we didn't have to live in fear. He showed us that bullies can be stopped, that criminals can be caught, and that good people working together can defeat evil. The applause was thunderous. As the party wound down and neighbors began cleaning up, Marcus found himself standing alone in his front yard, looking at the small vegetable garden that had started it all. The tomato plants were now 3 feet tall and covered with green fruit that would be ripe in a few weeks. James Crawford walked up beside him, holding 2 beers. "So what's next for the famous HOA fighter?" James asked with a grin. "I think I'm going to enjoy some peace and quiet," Marcus replied. "Maybe grow some peppers to go with these tomatoes. Take up fishing. Learn to play golf." "That sounds boring," James laughed. Marcus smiled and took a sip of his beer. After the past few months, boring sounds perfect. But even as he said it, Marcus knew that his fight against Margaret Henderson had changed him. He had discovered that civilian life could be just as meaningful as military service, as long as you were willing to stand up for what was right. 6 months later, Margaret Henderson was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. Richard Whitman received 12 years. Both were ordered to pay full restitution to all the residents they had defrauded. The Sunny Meadows HOA was dissolved and reformed with proper democratic governance. Marcus was elected as the first president of the new association, running unopposed. Under his leadership, the HOA adopted a simple set of rules focused on genuine community safety and property maintenance, while protecting residents' rights to express their individuality and cultural heritage. The Veterans HOA defense network that had formed around Marcus's case went on to help dozens of veterans across the country fight HOA discrimination. Several more criminal HOA conspiracies were exposed and prosecuted. And Marcus? He grew the best tomatoes in Arizona, painted his front door bright blue because he liked the color, and lived peacefully in a neighborhood where people were free to be themselves without fear of petty tyrants. Sometimes, the most important battles are fought not on foreign battlefields but in our own backyards, against bullies who think they can terrorize decent people with impunity. Marcus Thompson had proven that even the smallest act of resistance, planting a vegetable garden, could bring down an empire of corruption when backed by courage, intelligence, and the support of good neighbors. Margaret Henderson had learned too late that when you mess with a British Special Forces veteran, you'd better be prepared for a war you can't win.